Detective Ray Thompson walked through the police station like he owned the place. After 15 years on the force, he might as well have. Other officers stepped aside when they saw him coming down the hallway. Some nodded respectfully. Others just looked away. Everyone knew Ray's reputation, and most people preferred to stay on his good side. Ray had what you might call a special way of doing things. He didn't follow every rule in the book, but he got results. His arrest numbers were always high. His cases rarely fell apart in court, and somehow witnesses always seemed to remember things his way when it came time to testify. The department brass loved him for his statistics. They didn't ask too many questions about his methods. Thompson's got the magic touch. His partner, Jake, would joke, but Jake's laugh always sounded a little nervous when he said it. He'd seen Ray work, and magic wasn't exactly the word he would use in private. Ray learned early in his career that most people were afraid of the uniform. They saw the badge, the gun, the authority, and they automatically assumed he must be right about everything. If someone questioned him, Ray had ways of making them think twice. He never had to get violent or threatening. He just had to remind people who held the power in any situation. Take Mrs. Rodriguez from last month. She'd called in a noise complaint about her neighbor's party, but when Ray showed up, he decided she was the problem. Maybe it was the way she kept insisting the music was too loud. Maybe it was how she questioned why he wasn't talking to the party hosts instead. Ray didn't like being told how to do his job, so he wrote her a citation for filing a false report. Mrs. Rodriguez protested, said she had every right to complain about noise after midnight. Ray just smiled and told her she could explain it to the judge. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Rodriguez paid the fine rather than take time off work for court. Case closed. That's how Ray operated. He knew most people couldn't afford to fight the system even when they were right. They had jobs to keep, families to feed, reputations to protect. A criminal charge, even a minor one, could mess up someone's whole life. Ray used that knowledge like a tool. His desk was covered with commendation letters and thank you notes from citizens who appreciated his tough but fair approach to law enforcement. What those letter writers didn't know was that Ray had a filing cabinet full of complaints too. Allegations of misconduct, excessive force, harassment. But somehow those complaints never seemed to stick. Witnesses would change their stories. Evidence would disappear. Internal investigations would conclude there wasn't enough proof to take action. Ray's Sergeant Mike Patterson had been in the department for 25 years. He'd seen a lot of cops come and go, and he'd learned to pick his battles carefully. When complaints about Ray crossed his desk, Patterson would do the minimum required investigation and file it away. He told himself that Ray might bend the rules, but he wasn't breaking any laws. And besides, crime rates in Ray's district were down 15% since he'd been assigned there. The truth was, Patterson was getting close to retirement. He had 18 months left until he could collect his full pension. He didn't want any waves, any federal investigations, any media attention. Ray Thompson was a problem for the next guy to deal with. Ray understood this perfectly. He'd watched other cops get thrown under the bus for smaller infractions. The key was knowing who to push and who to leave alone. Know which complaints would disappear and which ones might actually go somewhere. Ray had built his career on reading people and situations, on knowing exactly how far he could go without crossing the line that would actually get him in trouble. His favorite targets were people who looked like they didn't belong in his neighborhood. Young men wearing hoodies after dark. Families who spoke languages other than English. Anyone who seemed nervous around cops, which Ray interpreted as a sign of guilt. He'd learned that these people rarely had the resources or connections to fight back effectively. Ray's wife, Linda, sometimes asked him about his work. She'd hear stories from neighbors about police officers who went too far, who abused their authority. Ray would just shake his head and tell her that people loved to complain about cops until they needed one. He painted himself as a dedicated public servant who was willing to make the tough decisions that other officers were too weak to make. Linda believed him because she wanted to. They had a nice house, good benefits, and 2 kids in college. Ray's salary and overtime pay made their comfortable life possible. She didn't want to think too hard about how he earned those performance bonuses. The other officers in Ray's unit had learned to work around him. When they got called to the same scene, They'd hang back and let Ray take the lead. Some of them genuinely believed he was a good cop who was just more decisive than most. Others suspected there was more to the story but didn't want to be the one to find out what that was. Detective Lisa Warner was one of the few who'd ever questioned Ray's methods directly. She'd been his partner briefly when she was new to the department. Lisa noticed how Ray's version of events always seemed to be the only version that mattered. She saw how witnesses would suddenly become cooperative after Ray spoke to them privately. When she asked about it, Ray told her she'd understand better once she had more experience. Lisa requested a transfer to a different unit after 6 months. She never filed a formal complaint, but she made sure never to work another case with Ray Thompson. She figured someone else would eventually notice what she'd seen. Someone with more seniority, more credibility, more courage than a rookie detective. But that someone never materialized. Ray's reputation only grew stronger. His conviction rate remained high. His supervisors continued to praise his dedication. And Ray himself became more convinced that he was untouchable. He started taking bigger risks, making bolder moves. If someone questioned his authority, Ray no longer just wrote them a ticket. He'd find reasons to arrest them, to search their car, to make their life complicated in ways that would teach them not to challenge police officers. Ray had convinced himself that he was doing important work. He was keeping the peace, maintaining order, teaching respect for law enforcement. If his methods were sometimes unconventional, well, that's what it took to do the job right. The streets were dangerous, and dangerous times called for strong measures. What Ray didn't realize was that his luck was about to run out. 15 years of bending rules and intimidating citizens had made him overconfident. He'd started to believe his own reputation, started to think that his badge really did make him untouchable. He was about to learn that every streak of luck eventually comes to an end. And sometimes, the end comes when you least expect it, in the form of someone who refuses to back down. It was Tuesday evening and the summer heat was still hanging in the air even though the sun was setting. Detective Ray Thompson was finishing his shift, cruising through the residential area near downtown. He'd had a quiet day, which meant his arrest numbers were down for the week. Ray didn't like quiet days. They made him look less productive than he preferred. That's when he spotted the silver sedan with out-of-state plates taking a right turn at the intersection ahead. The car moved through the turn perfectly legally, staying in its lane, using its signal. But Ray decided he saw something worth investigating. Maybe the car was going a little too slow. Maybe the driver looked nervous. Maybe Ray just needed a reason to make a stop. He hit his lights and followed the sedan as it pulled into a nearby parking lot. Ray took his time getting out of his patrol car, letting the driver sit and think about what might be happening. This was part of his standard approach. Make them wait, make them worry. People who were worried made mistakes, and mistakes gave Ray more options. The driver's window came down as Ray approached. Behind the wheel sat a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, with her hands visible on the steering wheel. She was calm, polite, and completely composed. This bothered Ray immediately. Most people were at least a little nervous during traffic stops. This woman looked like she was expecting him. "Good evening, officer," she said. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Dr. Amy Chen had been driving home from a community meeting about police accountability. As a civil rights attorney and former federal prosecutor, she'd spent the evening listening to residents share their experiences with local law enforcement. Some of the stories had been troubling. Some had been about officers who seemed to think the badge gave them unlimited power. "License and registration," Ray said, ignoring her question. "Step out of the vehicle." Dr. Chen remained calm. "I'd like to know the reason for the stop before I provide any documents. That's my right under the Fourth Amendment." Ray's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people who knew their rights, especially people who were confident enough to actually exercise them. Most drivers just handed over their documents and hoped for the best. This woman was challenging him right from the start. "I observed you driving erratically," Ray said. "Failure to maintain your lane, now step out of the car." Dr. Chen knew this was a lie. She'd been driving carefully, staying exactly within the speed limit using all her signals. She also knew that arguing about it on the side of the road wouldn't accomplish anything. But she wasn't going to make this easy for him either. I'm going to record this interaction, she said, pulling out her phone. I hope you don't mind. Ray minded very much. He'd never liked being recorded. It made him feel like every word and action was being judged by people who didn't understand police work. People who'd never had to deal with dangerous criminals or make split-second decisions. People who thought they could do his job better from the comfort of their living rooms. Put the phone away and step out of the vehicle, Ray said, his voice harder now. This is your last warning. Dr. Chen kept the phone recording but held it, down by her side. I'm complying with your instructions, officer. I just want to document this interaction for both our protection. What's your badge number? That question hit Ray like a slap. Badge numbers were public information, but in his experience, only troublemakers asked for them. People planning to file complaints. People who thought they could get cops in trouble. People who didn't understand that officers deserved respect, not interrogation. My badge number is none of your concern, Ray said. You're being arrested for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Dr. Chen remained seated in her car, her hand still visible. I haven't resisted anything, officer. I've been completely cooperative. I've answered your questions and I'm willing to provide my license. I haven't obstructed anything. But Ray was already reaching for his handcuffs. In his mind, this woman had challenged his authority from the moment she asked why he'd stopped her. She'd questioned his observations about her driving. She'd demanded his badge number like she had some right to interrogate him. And worst of all, she was recording everything, probably planning to edit the video to make him look bad. Ray had dealt with people like this before. Entitled citizens who thought they could lawyer their way out of traffic stops. People who forgot that police officers put their lives on the line every day to keep the community safe. People who needed to learn that there were consequences for disrespecting law enforcement. Out of the car. Now. Ray's hand moved to his weapon, not drawing it but making sure Dr. Chen could see the gesture. You're under arrest. Dr. Chen, finally, stepped out of the vehicle, still holding her phone. She moved slowly and deliberately, keeping her hands visible. Years of courtroom experience had taught her how quickly situations could escalate, and she knew that arguing with this officer wouldn't help her case. I'm not resisting, she said clearly, speaking toward her phone's microphone. I'm complying with all instructions. I'm unarmed, and I'm not threatening anyone. Ray spun her around and cuffed her hands behind her back, tighter than necessary. He was angry now, angrier than he usually got during arrests. This woman was treating him like he was the criminal, like he was doing something wrong. She was acting like she was the victim in this situation. You have the right to remain silent, Ray began. But his tone made it clear he hoped she wouldn't use that right. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. As he walked Dr. Chen to his patrol car, Ray felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. Another problem citizen had learned that questioning police authority had consequences. Another troublemaker was about to discover that the legal system supported officers who were just trying to do their jobs. What Ray didn't know was that Dr. Chen had been recording audio on her phone before he'd even approached her car. The entire interaction was documented, from his failure to provide a legitimate reason for the stop to his escalation of the situation when she'd exercised her constitutional rights. What Ray also didn't know was that Dr. Chen wasn't just any attorney. She was someone who'd built her career on cases exactly like this one, someone who understood police procedure, constitutional law, and federal civil rights statutes better than most judges. Someone who'd been hired by community organizations specifically to investigate patterns of police misconduct. And what Ray definitely didn't know was that this traffic stop was about to become the biggest mistake of his 15-year career. He drove Dr. Chen to the station for booking. Ray was already thinking about his report. He'd write it the same way he always did. The suspect was driving erratically. She became belligerent when stopped. She refused to comply with lawful orders. She forced him to make an arrest to maintain public safety. It was a story that had worked dozens of times before. Ray saw no reason why it wouldn't work again. Dr. Chen sat quietly in the back seat, thinking about everything she'd observed during the stop. The lack of probable cause, the officer's escalation tactics, His refusal to provide his badge number, the way he'd invented charges when she'd exercised her rights. She wasn't planning her defense. She was already building her case. Ray Thompson felt pretty good about himself as he finished the paperwork for Dr. Amy Chen's arrest. Another clean case, another problem citizen off the streets. He'd charged her with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest, both misdemeanor charges that would probably result in a plea deal and a fine. Most people didn't want to risk a trial, especially professionals who couldn't afford a criminal record. Ray had no idea who he'd just arrested. The name Amy Chen meant nothing to him. He hadn't bothered to look closely at her identification beyond checking that it was valid. He certainly hadn't noticed the Bar Association card in her wallet or the business cards identifying her as a federal civil rights attorney. What Ray also didn't know was that 3 months earlier, a coalition of community organizations had retained Dr. Chen to investigate complaints about his police department. Residents had been reporting a pattern of questionable arrests, excessive force, and harassment targeting certain neighborhoods. The coalition had pooled their resources to hire someone with the expertise to determine whether these complaints represented isolated incidents or something more systematic. Dr. Chen had spent weeks reviewing police reports, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing arrest data. She'd been building a case study of potential civil rights violations when Ray Thompson handed her the perfect example on a silver platter. While Ray was congratulating himself on another successful arrest, Dr. Chen was sitting in her holding cell making mental notes about every procedure he'd violated. As a former federal prosecutor, she knew police protocol inside and out. She'd trained law enforcement officers on constitutional requirements. She'd prosecuted cases where officers had crossed the line from legitimate law enforcement into criminal misconduct. The traffic stop had been textbook bad policing. No legitimate probable cause for the initial stop. Escalation without justification. Arrest for exercising constitutional rights. Failure to identify himself when requested. And all of it captured on audio recording. Dr. Chen's phone had been confiscated during booking, but not before she'd managed to upload the audio file to a secure cloud server. Even if the phone disappeared or was damaged, the evidence would survive. She'd also made note of the exact time and location of the stop, the officer's physical description, and his patrol car number. But the recording was just the beginning. Dr. Chen had already been investigating complaints about Officer Thompson's conduct. She had witness statements from other citizens who'd had similar experiences. She had arrest reports that showed a pattern of charges that were later dropped or dismissed. She had data showing that Thompson's arrest rate for certain types of crimes was significantly higher than other officers in his department. What Dr. Chen hadn't expected was to become a victim of the very misconduct she'd been hired to investigate. Thompson's decision to arrest her hadn't just given her a personal stake in the case. It had given her first-hand evidence of the behavior pattern she'd been documenting. The next morning, Dr. Chen was released on her own recognizance pending trial. The desk sergeant processing her release was polite and professional, clearly unaware of the storm that was about to hit his department. Dr. Chen thanked him courteously and walked out of the police station with a complete understanding of exactly what she needed to do next. Her first call was to her law partner, James Rodriguez, who'd been handling her caseload while she focused on the police misconduct investigation. James had worked with Dr. Chen for 8 years and had never seen her more focused than when she called that morning. "They arrested the wrong person, James," she said. "Thompson just handed us everything we need to prove our case." Dr. Chen's second call was to the coalition leaders who'd hired her. They'd been waiting months for her preliminary report on the police department. Now she had something much better than a report. She had a federal civil rights case that could change how the entire department operated. Meanwhile, Ray Thompson was starting his next shift completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. He'd forgotten about Amy Chen already, assuming she'd pay her fine and disappear like all the others. He had no idea that she'd spent the morning filing complaints with the police department's Internal Affairs Division, the mayor's office, and the FBI's Civil Rights Unit. Ray's Sergeant Mike Patterson was the first to realize they had a problem. Patterson had been planning to rubber stamp Thompson's arrest report like he always did, But his morning was interrupted by a call from the chief's office. Apparently, someone named Dr. Amy Chen was claiming she'd been illegally arrested by one of Patterson's officers. Patterson pulled Thompson's report and read it carefully for the first time in years. The story was the same as always: belligerent citizen, lawful arrest, textbook police work. But something about this case felt different. The complainant wasn't some random troublemaker. She was a lawyer with credentials and connections. She wasn't just threatening to file a complaint. She'd already filed multiple complaints with multiple agencies. Patterson called Thompson into his office and asked him to walk through the arrest again. Thompson repeated his story confidently. Erratic driving, suspicious behavior, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, standard procedure, clean case, nothing to worry about. "Did you know she's a lawyer?" Patterson asked. Thompson shrugged. "She didn't tell me that. Besides, it doesn't matter what someone does for a living. Break the law, get arrested. That's how it works." Patterson wasn't so sure. He'd been a cop long enough to know that some arrests attracted more attention than others. Arresting lawyers, doctors, judges, or politicians was always risky. These people had resources and connections that most citizens didn't have. They knew how to work the system. "Did you record the interaction?" Patterson asked. "No body cam was available," Thompson said. "Equipment problems." This was technically true. Thompson's body camera had been malfunctioning for 6 months. He'd filled out the required maintenance requests, but somehow the camera never got fixed. Patterson had never pushed the issue because Thompson's arrest numbers were so good, but now Patterson was wondering if those equipment problems had been more convenient than accidental, and he was starting to worry that Thompson's streak of successful arrests might be about to come to an end. What Patterson didn't know was that Dr. Chen had already obtained Thompson's disciplinary file through a public records request. She'd indeed discovered that his body camera had been broken for most of the past 2 years. She'd also found reports of other equipment failures, missing evidence, and witnesses who'd changed their stories after speaking with Thompson. Dr. Chen had been a federal prosecutor for 12 years before moving into civil rights law. She'd seen patterns like this before. She knew how to connect dots that other people missed, and she knew that Thompson's arrest of her wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a system that had been protecting bad cops for too long. By the end of the week, Dr. Chen had filed a federal lawsuit under Section 1983, alleging that Thompson had violated her civil rights under color of law. The lawsuit named not just Thompson but the entire police department and the city itself, claiming that they'd created a culture where constitutional violations were tolerated and covered up. The local newspaper picked up the story when the lawsuit was filed. Prominent civil rights attorney sues police department was front-page news in a city that had been struggling with police-community relations for years. Ray Thompson read the article at his kitchen table and felt his stomach drop. The woman he'd arrested wasn't just any lawyer. She was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in police misconduct cases. She'd won major settlements against other police departments. She had a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. For the first time in 15 years, Ray Thompson realized he might have made a mistake. A big one. Ray Thompson walked into the courthouse 6 months later feeling like he'd done this dance 100 times before. Criminal charges against Dr. Amy Chen for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. In Ray's experience, cases like this were usually settled before they got to trial. The defendant would accept a plea deal, pay a fine, maybe do some community service, and everyone would move on. But Dr. Chen had refused every plea offer. She'd insisted on going to trial, demanding her right to face her accuser in court. Ray's lawyer had warned him that this was unusual, but Ray wasn't worried. He had 15 years of successful testimony behind him. Judges trusted his word. Juries believed police officers over defendants. This case would be no different. What Ray didn't realize was that Dr. Chen had spent those 6 months preparing for this moment like a general planning a military campaign. She hadn't just been preparing her defense. She'd been building a comprehensive case about Ray's pattern of misconduct that went far beyond her own arrest. Dr. Chen had obtained video footage from security cameras at businesses near the traffic stop. She'd interviewed other citizens who'd been arrested by Ray under similar circumstances. She'd analyzed his arrest records going back 5 years and found a disturbing pattern of charges that were later dropped or dismissed. Most importantly, she'd hired a private investigator who discovered that Ray's body camera hadn't really been broken for 2 years. The department had been claiming equipment failures to avoid documenting interactions that might embarrass the force. Dr. Chen had receipts showing that replacement cameras had been purchased but never installed in Ray's patrol car. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in Judge Patricia Williams' courtroom. Judge Williams was known for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for anything that wasted her time. She'd seen plenty of police misconduct cases over her 20 years on the bench, and she could usually tell within the first hour whether the allegations had merit. The prosecutor handling the case against Dr. Chen was David Park, a young attorney, who'd been assigned the case because none of the senior prosecutors wanted to touch it. Park had reviewed Ray's report and assumed it would be a straightforward case. Police officer makes lawful arrest. Defendant tries to claim violation of rights. Jury sides with law enforcement. But when Park met with Ray to prepare for testimony, he started to have doubts. Ray's story was consistent, but it felt rehearsed. Every detail was perfectly polished. Every sequence of events followed exactly the same pattern as his previous arrests. Park had prosecuted enough cases to know the difference between genuine testimony and a performance. Dr. Chen represented herself at trial, which was her right as a licensed attorney. She'd decided against hiring outside counsel because she knew her own case better than anyone else could. She also knew that representing herself would send a message to the jury that she was confident in her innocence. When Ray took the witness stand, he delivered his usual professional testimony. He spoke clearly and confidently, making eye contact with the jury. He explained how he'd observed Dr. Chen driving erratically, how she'd become belligerent during the traffic stop, how she'd refused to comply with his lawful orders. The defendant was clearly agitated and argumentative, Ray testified. She refused to provide identification and began making demands about my badge number. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she became increasingly hostile. Park nodded along, feeling more confident as Ray's testimony proceeded. This sounded like standard police procedure. Ray came across as a professional officer who'd been forced to make a difficult arrest to maintain public safety. But then Dr. Chen began her cross-examination, and everything changed. Officer Thompson, you testified that you observed my vehicle, weaving between lanes. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. Dr. Chen approached the witness stand with a tablet in her hands. I'd like to show you security footage from the intersection where you first observed my vehicle. The prosecutor objected, claiming the footage hadn't been properly authenticated. But Dr. Chen had done her homework. She'd subpoenaed the footage months earlier and had it authenticated by the business owner who'd provided it. Judge Williams allowed the footage to be shown. The video clearly showed Dr. Chen's car moving through the intersection in a perfectly straight line, staying within her lane using proper signals. There was no erratic driving visible anywhere in the footage. Ray watched the video with growing discomfort. He'd expected Dr. Chen to challenge his version of events, but he hadn't expected her to have video evidence. Most citizens didn't have access to security footage from local businesses. Officer Thompson, does this footage show the erratic driving you described in your testimony? Ray hesitated for the first time. The video quality isn't very clear. It's difficult to see exactly. What happened? Dr. Chen moved closer to the witness stand. The footage is time-stamped at exactly the time and location you specified in your police report. Are you saying your eyes are more reliable than this high-definition security camera? The prosecutor objected again, but Judge Williams was leaning forward in her seat, clearly interested in where this was going. Dr. Chen continued her cross-examination for 2 hours, systematically dismantling every aspect of Ray's testimony. She played the audio recording of their interaction, demonstrating that she'd been polite and cooperative throughout the stop. She showed that Ray had never provided a legitimate reason for the arrest. She proved that he'd escalated the situation when she'd exercised her constitutional rights. But the most damaging moment came when Dr. Chen asked about Ray's body camera. Officer Thompson, why wasn't this interaction recorded on your body camera? Equipment malfunction, Ray answered automatically. Doctor, Chen smiled. How long has your body camera been malfunctioning? I'm not sure exactly. Several months. Would it surprise you to learn that your body camera has been listed as inoperable for 23 months? Ray's lawyer objected, but Dr. Chen was ready with maintenance records she'd obtained through discovery. And would it surprise you to learn that replacement cameras were purchased by your department 8 months ago but were never installed in your patrol vehicle? Ray felt sweo. TT forming on his forehead. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. Dr. Chen wasn't finished. She called witnesses who'd been arrested by Ray under similar circumstances. She presented statistical analysis showing that Ray's arrest rate for obstruction and resisting charges was 3 times higher than any other officer in his department. She demonstrated a pattern of behavior that went far beyond her own case. The prosecutor realized his case was falling apart, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. Every piece of evidence supported Dr. Chen's version of events. Every witness contradicted Ray's testimony. Every document revealed another layer of misconduct. When Dr. Chen finished presenting her defense, Judge Williams didn't even wait for closing arguments. I've heard enough, she announced. All charges against Dr. Chen are dismissed with prejudice. Officer Thompson, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into your conduct, and I'm forwarding this case to the FBI for potential federal civil rights violations. Ray Thompson walked out of the courthouse a different man than he'd walked in. For 15 years, he'd believed his badge made him untouchable. Now he was facing not just the end of his career, but potential federal charges that could send him to prison. The local media was waiting outside the courthouse. Dr. Chen gave a brief statement about the importance of police accountability and constitutional rights. Ray hurried to his car without speaking to anyone, but the trial was just the beginning. Dr. Chen's case had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Other victims were coming forward. Federal investigators were asking questions, and Ray Thompson was learning that badges don't protect officers who abuse their power. They just make the fall from grace that much longer. The FBI arrived at Ray Thompson's house on a quiet Thursday morning 3 months after the trial. 2 agents in dark suits knocked on his door while he was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. Ray had been expecting this visit ever since Judge Williams had forwarded his case to federal investigators, but seeing the agents on his doorstep still made his stomach drop. Detective Thompson? We're with the FBI Civil Rights Division. We'd like to ask you some questions about your arrest of Dr. Amy Chen and several other incidents. Ray's lawyer had told him not to speak with federal agents without representation, but part of him wanted to explain his side of the story. For months, he'd watched his reputation crumble in the local media. Former colleagues avoided him at the grocery store. His wife had started getting hostile looks from neighbors who recognized her as the wife of that cop who got exposed in court. The FBI investigation had started with Dr. Chen's case, but it quickly expanded as more victims came forward. The agents had interviewed dozens of people who claimed Ray had violated their rights during traffic stops, arrests, and investigations. They'd reviewed hundreds of police reports and found patterns that painted a disturbing picture of systematic misconduct. What made the federal case particularly strong was that Dr. Chen had provided investigators with a roadmap. Her own investigation had identified the key witnesses, documented the pattern of behavior, and collected evidence that would have taken federal agents months to gather on their own. Ray's department tried to distance themselves from him as the investigation intensified. Chief Rodriguez announced that Thompson had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the federal inquiry. Internal Affairs opened their own investigation, though everyone knew it was too little, too late. Sergeant Mike Patterson, who had enabled Ray's behavior for years, suddenly found himself under investigation too. Federal agents were asking hard questions about his supervision and oversight. Why had he approved so many questionable arrests? Why had he never investigated complaints against Thompson? Why had equipment problems persisted for so long without being addressed? Patterson realized his comfortable retirement plan was in jeopardy. He decided to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for leniency. He provided them with documentation showing that the department had a pattern of covering up misconduct complaints. He admitted that he'd never seriously investigated allegations against Thompson because it was easier to file them away and hope they'd disappear. The federal investigation revealed that Ray's misconduct was part of a larger cultural problem within the police department. Officers routinely filed false reports, covered for each other's mistakes, and intimidated witnesses who might contradict their version of events. Body cameras malfunctioned whenever interactions might embarrass the department. Evidence disappeared from storage rooms. Complaints were buried in bureaucratic procedures that discouraged citizens from pursuing them. Dr. Chen had been right about the systematic nature of the problem. Ray Thompson wasn't a bad apple in an otherwise good barrel. He was a symptom of institutional rot that had been festering for years. The federal charges against Ray came down 6 months after the FBI visit. Conspiracy to violate civil rights, under color of law, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice. Each charge carried potential prison time, and the government was seeking consecutive sentences that could put Ray behind bars for decades. Ray's criminal trial was very different from the civil rights case Dr. Chen had filed. The federal prosecutors had unlimited resources, experienced investigators, and a mountain of evidence. They presented case after case of citizens who'd been illegally arrested, harassed, or intimidated by Ray Thompson. The jury heard testimony from Mrs. Rodriguez, the woman who'd been cited for filing a false noise complaint. They learned about a teenager who'd been arrested for disorderly conduct after questioning why Ray had stopped him for walking in his own neighborhood. They saw documentation of dozens of arrests that followed the same pattern. Minor infractions escalated into serious charges when citizens exercised their constitutional rights. Dr. Chen testified as a witness in the federal trial, describing not just her own arrest but the broader investigation that had revealed the scope of Ray's misconduct. Her testimony was devastating because she could speak as both a victim and an expert on civil rights law. Ray's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been a dedicated officer who'd made some mistakes under difficult circumstances. He painted Ray as a scapegoat for broader problems within the police department, a hard-working cop who'd been thrown under the bus by superiors who were trying to save their own careers. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Williams, who had presided over Dr. Chen's original case, was assigned to handle Ray's sentencing. She'd seen the full scope of his misconduct now, and she wasn't inclined to show mercy. "Mr. Thompson," she said at sentencing, "you took an oath to serve and protect the citizens of this community. Instead, you used your badge as a weapon to intimidate, harass, and violate the rights of the people you were sworn to defend. Your actions didn't just harm individual victims. They undermined public trust in law enforcement and damaged the reputation of every honest police officer in this city." Ray was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His pension was revoked. His conviction made him ineligible for any future law enforcement employment. The man who had once believed his badge made him untouchable would spend the next decade behind bars with the criminals he'd once arrested. But Ray's conviction was just the beginning of the changes that followed Dr. Chen's case. The federal investigation led to a consent decree requiring the police department to implement comprehensive reforms. Body cameras became mandatory and were actually maintained. Use of force policies were rewritten. Officers received new training on constitutional rights and de-escalation techniques. Dr. Chen was hired as an independent monitor to oversee the implementation of these reforms. Her job was to ensure that the changes were real and lasting, not just cosmetic improvements designed to satisfy federal investigators. The civil lawsuit Dr. Chen had filed against the city resulted in a substantial settlement that funded community programs and police accountability measures. Other victims of Ray's misconduct filed their own lawsuits, resulting in millions of dollars in payments that came from taxpayer funds and police insurance policies. Some officers complained that the reforms made their jobs more difficult. They argued that criminals would be emboldened if police couldn't be aggressive in their law enforcement efforts. But crime rates in the city actually decreased as community relations improved and citizens became more willing to cooperate with investigations. Ray Thompson's case became a textbook example in law schools and police academies across the country. It demonstrated how a single officer's misconduct could expose institutional problems that had been hidden for years. It showed the importance of accountability mechanisms and the danger of allowing bad behavior to go unchecked. For Dr. Chen, the case represented both a personal victory and a professional validation of her work on police reform. She'd been hired to investigate potential misconduct and had ended up becoming a victim herself. But that personal experience had given her case an authenticity and power that transformed how people understood police accountability issues. Ray Thompson learned the hardest possible lesson about the limits of authority. He'd spent 15 years believing that his badge protected him from consequences. He'd thought that citizens were powerless against the police system, and that other officers would always protect their own. In federal prison, Ray had plenty of time to think about the choices that had led him there. He realized that his downfall hadn't started with Dr. Chen's arrest. It had started years earlier when he'd first decided that the rules didn't apply to him. The badge hadn't made him supreme. It had just given him enough rope to hang himself. And sometimes justice comes in the form of someone who refuses to be intimidated, someone who knows their rights and has the courage to fight for them. Someone like Dr. Amy Chen, who turned one illegal arrest into a movement for change that would protect countless future victims from officers who forgot that they worked for the people, not the other way around.